Welcome, everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. And on LinkedIn, subscribe to us at Campaign for GLR. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. The webinar will begin shortly. It will be recorded and shared with you afterwards. Alrighty, hello everyone. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this webinar. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we'd love for you to introduce yourself. So please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box. We'll be dedicating some time towards the end of the conversation to respond to those questions. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to the recording, as well as any resources, slides, and bios shared during the conversation, will be sent in a follow-up email to all who registered. And finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. I also want to take a minute to share that we are in the midst of planning a very exciting GLR Week 2023 and ask you to please save the date and plan to join us from July 17th through the 21st, and to stay tuned for more specific information coming to you very soon via email. And lastly, I want to call your attention to our upcoming learning and engagement opportunities. In the next 2 weeks, we have a series of double headers. First, next week on June 6th, we have 2 sessions. The first, a co-sponsored session with the Patterson Foundation that will explore how funders are closing the gap in digital literacy. Then at 3 p.m. that day, we'll have the chance to follow the science and explore bilingualism as an asset supporting early brain development. The following week on June 13th, we have a special session at 12:30 Eastern Time focused on the critical role of housing agencies in supporting regular attendance and engagement in school. We'll be sure to add a link in the chat box for more information and registration for these opportunities, and we hope you can join us. Joining you now is Emily Samos, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra, and welcome to each and every one of you. And thank you for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar titled Opportunities and Potential Pitfalls, State Expansion of Education Savings Accounts. In our GLR Learning Tuesdays, the Campaign for Grade Level Reading intends to advance the science, ideas, and innovations to close opportunity gaps for vulnerable kids and explore strategies that are impacting early school success. Oftentimes, this means examining policies and practices that are prominent in the headlines because they may be controversial in some way. We want to use these webinars as a platform and forum for thoughtful and nuanced conversations that go beyond the headlines and the contention, and that dig into the data and the research to understand the implications for these policies and practices for children from economically challenged families. It is incredibly important to explore controversial topics and understand all sides of an issue through thoughtful and balanced discussion, and today's session will give us a chance to do just that. Education savings accounts, or ESAs, give families access to public per-pupil funds that can be used to pay for tuition to private schools, access to other public schools, homeschooling supplies, curriculum materials, online learning, tutoring support, and educational therapy services. They have currently been approved in 13 states, having gained increased popularity in the wake of the pandemic. 9 states have passed some version of an ESA program or expansion to a previous ESA policy since the start of 2021, with 4 additional states approving ESAs for any student this year. Proponents of school choice see this as a necessary way to allow students to learn in the setting that works best for them And skeptics see this as a divestment in public school systems at a time when they need as much support as possible to continue to recover and accelerate learning for students, especially the vulnerable students most highly impacted by the pandemic. In today's discussion, we will have the chance to first understand what an education savings account is and how it's different from a voucher in terms of how funds flow, and clarify some of the headlines that may be causing confusion. We will engage in a thoughtful and in-depth discussion with leaders about state and district trends and what data indicates about which families are taking advantage of ESAs and why. We will explore what implementation looks like in 2 specific states and learn from both proponents and skeptics about why they have the perspectives that they do on this controversial policy. And we are super lucky to have an extremely engaging moderator to lead us through our balanced and informative discussion. And I will briefly introduce our moderator and all of our speakers for today, but please note that full bios are linked in the chat. So we're just going to do a quick review of who we have with us. First of all, our great moderator is Terry Caldwell Johnson, and she serves as the CEO of the Oak Ridge Neighborhood and Oak Ridge Neighborhood Services, a housing and human services nonprofit agency located in Des Moines, Iowa. Terry is also chair of the Des Moines School Board and has been elected to 3 4-year terms beginning in 2006. Our presenters for today include Ben DeGrow, who is the Policy Director of Education Choice for Excel in Ed. Ben has worked nearly 2 decades in state-based public policy, providing expert analysis in school choice, school finance, and more. Previously at Colorado's Independence Institute and Michigan's Mechanic Center for Public Policy, he led dozens of studies and research projects. Kate Baker Demers is the executive director of the Children's Scholarship Fund New Hampshire and was the first to implement the New Hampshire Education Freedom Account program, where families earning up to 300% of the poverty line can direct part of their children's state education funding to pay for tuition, tutoring, online learning programs, educational supplies, and other educational expenses. Joanne Mickens has served as the executive director of Parents for Public Schools, a national organization headquartered in Jackson, Mississippi since 2018. Before joining Parents for Public Schools, Joanne taught history and civics, first in Richmond, Virginia, and then Warrensville Heights, Ohio. She was also a manager with Bell South Telecommunications for several years, and for several years ran her own consulting company. And finally, Beth Lewis is a mom, a public education advocate, and a K-12 policy expert who fights for a fully and equitably funded school for every Arizona child. As director of Save Our Schools Arizona, Beth works to bring parents, educators, elected officials, business leaders, and community members together in support of Arizona's public schools, which strengthen our communities and her great state. And so with that, I am really happy to turn it over to Terry to engage our panelists in a robust conversation today. Terry.
Thank you, Emily. And I have to tell you, I'm really excited about this afternoon's conversation. I think it's going to be a spirited and engaging discussion based on our pre-work with the panelists. And I really want to encourage everybody to lean into this subject. It's one that is emerging across every state in this country. And it's one that we really need to be aware of as we begin to think about public policy, as we begin to think about education policy, and we contextualize that with regard to public education. So with that, I would like to introduce and thank again Ben DeGrow from Excel in Ed. Ben, if you wouldn't mind helping us all to frame this really interesting conversation and discussion around how we define education savings accounts. In some states, we call it vouchers. In others, we call it tax credits. Just help us understand that. And are there specifically differentiating details that help us define one versus the other? Ben?
Thank you, Terry, for the kind introduction. And thank you to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for the opportunity to participate here and putting on this great event. The issue of education choice and the issue of literacy are both close to the heart of our organization at Excel in Ed. So to frame the conversation about education scholarship accounts, it's helpful to step back and go to the next slide to think about this in concept of education choice is premised on the idea of the need to meet the individual needs of students by offering the widest range of possible opportunities in a pluralistic system that recognizes no individual school can meet the need of every child. So giving families the broadest access to opportunities and engaging parents, not only as essential partners in their children's education process, but recognizing their important decision-making role in their children's education, implementing policies that will ultimately meet those needs of helping that individual child learn and thrive. So here is just a display of kind of the realm of different possible components of education choice. The three at the top were the ones we were particularly going to focus on in this question to get a better bead on ESAs or education scholarship accounts. So we'll move to the next slide. So this conversation around private education choice is helpful to frame under the larger umbrella of giving students opportunities to participate with either public funding or publicly incentivized funding to choose some form of non-public education to meet their needs. So many are familiar with vouchers. Vouchers are state-funded coupons. Basically, it's endorsing the back of a check, and the state says for the parent, the family, for the student who wants to go to a private school that participates in the program, the state is going to underwrite some or all of that cost for the student to go to a private school. A tax credit scholarship is a similar function from the parent's side, but the difference is that it is funded not direct by appropriations from the state legislature, but by donations that are incentivized by state policy. So when a donor, an individual or business makes a contribution to a nonprofit organization that gives out scholarships to students to attend a private school, then they get a tax write-off. That's in brief. Those are common programs that have been around for 20 to 30 years, but the most recent iteration is education scholarship accounts, sometimes called education savings accounts. We'll call them ESAs from the rest of the conversation here. What sets ESAs apart, and what we're going to focus on, is the level of flexibility they give families to choose. Now, while there are ESA programs in many states, the specific details of how families can spend the money will vary from state to state. But in broad terms, this will allow families to use their state-supervised, state-funded account to purchase anything from private school tuition, tutoring services, therapies for children with special needs, online education, transportation to a school, testing fees, some cases extracurricular activities, in some cases public school courses or activities as well. So the idea here is to maximize that idea of educational opportunity focused on the individual student by giving parents the greatest possible amount of latitude to customize that education within defined guardrails created as the state sets up an ESA program.
Thanks, Ben. That was really helpful. And I think it really helps to better frame how we in this conversation are defining how different states are enumerating what they're doing relative to school choice. So shortly we'll hear from the rest of the panelists, but let's do one more sort of setup. And Ben, I'm going to come back to you for this relative to just sort of the lay of the land. What are we seeing across the country relative to these programs? How many states? What are the number of students that are taking advantage? And where do we see the momentum coming from when it comes to the growth in vouchers or ESAs?
Thank you for that. And we'll transition to the next slide that hopefully help us to see how dynamic and fast changing this landscape is. So these numbers here you see are from the previous school year of 2021 and 22. And this will kind of set the stage to see how quickly changing the landscape around private school choice is. This is depicting the number of students known to participate in one of those three types of programs that I just mentioned. The top line would be voucher programs, tax credit scholarship programs, which represent the largest portion. The middle is voucher programs. And then way down at the bottom in 2022, you can see about just over 30,000 students participating in ESA programs. We'll move to the next slide and get a sense of how quickly changing this is. So ESAs originated in Arizona. They were passed in 2011. When they came on board the next year, there were fewer than a couple hundred students participating. And over a decade later, here we are in the 2022-2023 school year, and we have about 100,000, over 100,000 students participating and receiving one of these state supervised, state funded multi-use education accounts. The reason I put 100,000 plus here is because the number is quickly and rapidly changing all the time. And maybe to illustrate just how dynamic this is, I have to apologize to Emily who introduced this, who said there were 13 states with ESAs. Well, in the time between sending her the introductory text and today, we have a new state. So there are now 14 states with ESA programs. And by our latest estimates, somewhere north of 130,000 students who are participating using these funds in various ways. That number is sure to grow in the next year and coming years. That growth that number I mentioned accounts for the fact that last year, the state of Arizona passed a fully universal program, which we can talk more about in terms of student eligibility. And that program has grown rapidly in the time since. This year, we have 3 new states that have passed universal ESA programs. That would be Iowa, Arkansas, Utah. Those programs don't have any students yet, so they're not counted in the numbers. The state of Florida, which has had an ESA program, the second oldest and the biggest program, expanded its program to universal eligibility. And there are well over 100,000 students who have already signed up for that program. So those numbers for next year are going to get even larger by magnitudes we're not even sure how to quantify yet. So the fact that you're focusing on this particular policy is very timely and very significant. I will point out that there are distinctions. The early ESA programs you see in Arizona, Florida, Mississippi, Tennessee, North Carolina, which I highlight on the right, were all states that were focused on providing these kind of flexible spending to families with students who had individualized education programs, special needs, special learners. The more recent iteration of programs, largely fueled and motivated by the challenges associated with COVID and the policies in response to COVID, and related controversies and challenges have fueled the growth of a lot of these new programs and expanded programs that have brought us to the 14 states and somewhere over 130,000 students and growing that we have today.
Thanks, Ben. That was really helpful, not only in terms of understanding the definitions, but also the data and the trends that we're seeing. And of course, the new states that are moving into this space, including my state, the state of Iowa. So let's turn to our panelists now. And I think it's interesting that Arizona is the state that has had the longest standing program. So I'd like to turn first to Beth Lewis, who is with the Save Our Schools Arizona Network. And Beth, can you talk a little bit about your state's policymakers and constituents, not only how they are defining ESAs, but what public policy looks like in the state of Arizona?
Of course. Thank you so much, Terry and Emily and everybody who's here. Thanks for the opportunity to share our story. You know, Arizona accounts for over half of those numbers, the 100,000 that Ben was just referencing. And so we, you know, have a very on the ground perspective of, you know, what's happening. So I'm glad to jump right in. Save Our Schools Arizona Network is a grassroots nonpartisan advocacy group. We are parents, teachers, concerned citizens all across the state who support and advocate for strong, fully funded public schools. Arizona, as many of you probably know, is desperately underfunded when it comes to public education. We're 48th in the country in per student spending. I've been a teacher in Arizona for the last 12 years, taught elementary and middle school, so I've seen firsthand the dramatic impacts of chronic underfunding and the inequities across the schools in our state. I'm also heading the PTO at my local school, which is low income, and see how hard it is to, you know, raise funds and get students what they need. Here in Arizona, we can't really talk about vouchers and ESAs without talking about this defunding, because it is part and parcel. It's important to point out that it has been driven by the same special interests, and many of them are out of state, really well-moneyed groups that are pouring billions into Arizona to sort of push this agenda. And that's what we've seen here. I know other states across the country are seeing that, and I think it's important to look out for that. We've hurt generations of students by moving from, middle of the pack in education funding to 48th, and my kids included. My son's going into middle school, and I don't have any hope that he is going to have a fully funded, extremely quality education compared to his peers, and it's sad. So I'll jump in to the next slide to talk about sort of the realities of what we've seen. As Ben said, Arizona is the first state in the nation to pass universal vouchers, even though voters resoundingly rejected that notion in 2018. Our former governor and the legislature last year decided to pass universal vouchers. Here they're called empowerment scholarship accounts. We call them ESA vouchers, based on Ben's definition. If it walks like a voucher and talks like a voucher, it's a voucher. So we, here it's commonly called a voucher. They're public taxpayer dollars loaded onto a debit card. They can be used for private school, for homeschool expenses, also micro schools, which I know the whole country is seeing. Generally, there are small schools that don't have, trained teachers or curriculum. Typically, they're set up in a small setting like a home or a church with no oversight. And in Arizona, all of that funding, if it's not used for tuition or expenses, can be rolled over and used for post-secondary, even though that's subtracting from local public schools. There's no means testing in Arizona. So I know that Iowa had some. There's some other states that have dedicated the program to low-income families. We don't have that here, and we don't have any financial oversight or public transparency into how the funds are being used. And if you go to the next slide, you can see a graph of those funds. So as Ben said, we started in 2011, it was implemented in 2012. It was sold as a $1 million program for special needs families that would only help, students who had the most severe needs to be met. And then slowly that was systematically expanded over time. And you can see this huge jump in 2023, where we saw that universal expansion. And I'll talk a little bit about who's using that too, but for here, you can see that those dollars are massive. We're spending over $500 million this year. The legislature failed to budget for most of that. At least 300 million of that was completely unbudgeted. So they had to sort of scrape from the couch cushions in this year's budget. And there's no money for it next year. The numbers for next year are extremely conservative on this graph. Right now, the program's growing by 1,000 kids a week. So that could reach $1 billion by next year. And our state does not have the funds to cover that. And just for perspective, that's like 1/8 of our public school budget that would be going to private schools and homeschools with no transparency or accountability. And then on the next slide, we can see that, the people who are really using this program so far are tending to be people who had already made a choice around private school or homeschool. So they were paying for that out of their own pockets and are now recouping government funds to pay for that. That's why so much was unbudgeted, and just something that I think, other states should look at as a cautionary tale. There was no funding budgeted for those students that had already made that choice. And, you'll hear, oh, the money should follow the child, but there was no money budgeted for those children. So the money is actually being subtracted from our local public schools. And that hurts the families that rely on our local public schools most. So low income families, rural families who don't have those other options and are really counting on a fully funded local public school. And that's why in Arizona, it really can't be a both and, because when you see the realities on the ground, local public schools are being drained of resources to prop up this private program.
Thank you, Beth. You know, it's interesting. You bring multiple perspectives to this discussion, not only as a former classroom teacher, but also as a PTO member and also as an advocate. So I think your perspective is very helpful, and recognizing and understanding the Arizona experience as the first, I think really helps to inform where we're going and what we can anticipate seeing. So thank you for those comments. I'm now going to turn to the East Coast and our friend Kate Baker Demers. Kate is the executive director of the Children's Scholarship Fund of New Hampshire. And Kate brings a very, very interesting perspective to this discussion. So Kate, please tell us a little bit about your organization, also how ESAs are defined in New Hampshire, and what policy looks like on the ground where you are.
Sure, happy to do that. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. Thanks again, Terry. Just for a little background, I started this scholarship fund in New Hampshire when I was a single mom, just trying to do right by my own kids. I was in one of those neighborhoods, we'll call it kind of the wrong side of town, and I was struggling to find the right fit for my child. In a school, our neighborhood assigned school told me that they couldn't meet her needs and that I needed to find a different kind of school. And at the time I couldn't afford it. So I started this scholarship fund in New Hampshire to kind of help. Of course, you know, a single mom will do kind of whatever it takes for her own kids to get them, you know, what they need. Little did I know that I would end up being in essence kind of the emergency education response, you know, to the pandemic. In the wake of the pandemic, you know, everyone's saying we should be rethinking and reimagining education. And at that time, my phone rang off the hook, and I put up some pictures on this slide of really the families that drove this education savings account program into being in New Hampshire, so that you can kind of understand what was happening here. Down in the bottom left is the Moyo family, and that was another single parent. The Moyo's dad is a single dad, and he was driving a truck. He was one of those essential workers. And at the time, he didn't have a place for his children to go during the day. And so he contacted us trying to find a school that was open during the pandemic shutdowns so that he could continue to work driving that truck. You know, being an essential worker at that time, you really were in a rock and a hard place, particularly if you were a single parent and an essential worker. You were really in a jam trying to find some type of daytime space for your child to go. And so the Moyo family, I remember him calling me saying, I need to find a school that's open. If I can't work, I can't pay my rent. If I can't pay my rent, then we'll be homeless. And so that, you know, was just really a tough season for all of us. I mean, the pandemic really exacerbated the challenges of our most vulnerable families. The family, it says Swenson over on your right-hand side. That was a family who has medically fragile children. And so even when the schools reopened, those children weren't able to go back into the building at the time. You know, I remember answering the phone. I was kind of thinking of these homeschoolers as like emergency homeschoolers, right? They weren't people that were choosing to homeschool their children. At the time, they were people who were in an emergency situation where their kids' health was in jeopardy and they were concerned about them. And so they wanted to keep them home and not have them go into a building. I mean, I know it's probably hard to think back. All of us probably have blocked it out at this point, right? Trying to imagine in our minds that, you know, that didn't happen to kids and teachers and families. But at that time, there were many children who couldn't go into a building setting. And those families really drove this program into being. Our New Hampshire legislature was really considering, what if something like this happened in the future? How would they be able to make money, resources, tutors, laptops? I remember at the time, there were places in New Hampshire's fairly rural state. There were places where people didn't have internet access, or money to pay for internet access, and also didn't have computers at the time, or a tutor while they were remote learning. And so our legislature was really thinking towards the future. If something like this was to ever happen again, they wanted to make sure that a family could get access to a small amount of money to at least be able to cover their basic needs until their school reopened. Another interesting thing that happened, the two families towards the center, the Leggett family and the Florent family, those were teachers who were unhappy with the circumstance that they were in. They did not want to be in a school building, in essence, perhaps, endangering their children's health. And so they decided to turn into homeschoolers and homeschool their own children after the pandemic. The Florent family, the mom is a Montessori teacher. And so for her, she thought, okay, I can do Montessori for my children at home. And she decided that that was a better experience for her. And then the Leggett family, she was a high school math teacher. She also has a medically fragile child. So I think that was part of her decision to become a homeschooler and use an education savings account, because again, with her children's health, for her to go into a building, it was a difficult situation. I included here the Bresnahan family. So many of the children who participate in our programs experience discrimination. I have a few more of those children on the slides, but New Hampshire is a state where about 90% of our citizens are white and 10% are diverse. Our program is about 80-20. We're about twice as diverse as our state as a whole, the children participating in our programs. And many of them tell us they experience discrimination in their schools and they need to go to a school building that is safe. And yes, I am the both and girl. I feel like every building should be open to every child, regardless of their income. Our program also is for low and moderate income families. You have to be 300% of the poverty line or below to participate. And what it looks like now is families in our program are choosing multiple education providers. So I can think of a high school student who's taking and using their education savings account to pay for two AP classes at a public high school. They're taking one class at a private school that they need more help in, and they wanted that smaller class size. They're also using a tutor for that particular class that they need more help in. And then a few of their other classes are through an online education provider. And so these education savings accounts are really giving families in New Hampshire the opportunity to get learning experiences that match with what they now know is the right fit for their family. The parents of today are not the same parents pre-pandemic. All of us had our kids at home, remote learning in different kinds of situations, and we really got to see and know what works for them. And these are the New Hampshire parents that drove this program into being. They really believe that they should have the power to spend those education dollars and the taxes that they pay for education on an education that is just right for their kids to thrive.
Thank you for that, Kate. And really thank you for putting names and faces to the New Hampshire experience, which I think provides a lot of context for what's happening in your state. So really appreciate that. So now we're going to turn our attention to Joanne Mickens. Joanne is the Executive Director of Parents for Public Schools, and she's really leading a national parent-facing organization that helps to educate and train parents to not only understand, but to get engaged in school decision-making. So Joanne, tell us a little bit about your organization, how you and your organization are defining ESAs, and of course, your perspective on the issue. Joanne? I think you're still on mute.
Thank you, Terry. And thank you, Emily, for inviting me to be a part of this, this panel today. I've heard some really good stuff so far, and In fact, Kate makes a real case for school choice. Unfortunately, I'm not sure I'm buying it. But our mission here at Parents for Public Schools is to advance the role of families and communities in securing a high quality public education for every child. And the emphasis is on public, because no matter how many we might mention deficiencies or concerns that parents have, I think our public schools are the only place where you don't have to apply. We just want to know your name and address. And it's open to everybody with any kind of disability. They're open to anyone who speaks any language, of any skin color, of any geography within that school community. So public schools for us are always the answer. Now, when we think about the beginnings of Parents for Public Schools, we saw a pushback against what school choice, I believe, is doing today. I believe that because Parents for Public Schools was created to combat white flight from the public schools of Jackson, it was an organization that has always existed to bring us together rather than creating niches for us to go into to keep us apart. And so our organization is, to me, from the very beginning, has emphasized how can we work all of this out together. And so no matter what concern, there are, of course, there are opportunities, there are situations in which families have very special needs, but the question becomes, who pays for those needs? Who pays to address them? That if my tax dollars are going into the pot, maybe I don't want my tax dollars used for you to educate your child at home, where there is no accountability, no transparency. And so we are for public schools, as our name says. The next slide basically points out that we were created in Jackson, Mississippi in 1989. So we've been around for a long time. And currently we have 9 chapters in 7 states. As to your question, Terry, about how we see ESAs, ESAs are vouchers. And by that I mean, in our view, ESAs are a means, and we put a real nice title on it, but they're a means to take public dollars and take them away from the accountability of the public. And shortly after our organization was created back in 1996, we made a statement on vouchers. And what that statement says is that PPS unequivocally opposes vouchers, not only vouchers, but tuition tax credits or any programs which divert public resources from the public schools, or just as importantly, divide the potential constituency for those schools. And so we are an organization that, if you ask us how we see ESAs, we see them as a way of diverting public dollars into private uses. And we are not in favor of those.
Thank you, Joanne. I think we got a little behind on the slide, so maybe we can catch up on that. But go ahead.
No, it's all good.
Okay, all right. But is there anything in particular, especially on the next slide, Joanne, that you want to lift up relative to what ESA? Oh, I'm sorry. That's the next slide. Sorry.
Yeah.
So appreciate your comments and appreciate the work that you're doing. I also noted that you have chapters in 7 states across the country.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how a state or an entity may become a chapter?
Oh, well, we are grassroots, which means that a state can't become a chapter, but that a school community within a state can. And we don't plant chapters. Parents come to us. They can express interest in our mission and how we go about are doing our business, and they come to us, and there is an application process for parents for public schools, but they go through that process, and we help them to become a member of our network. And so any
Awesome.
parents anywhere can join the network of parents for public schools.
Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. There may be those who are on the call that might be interested in pulling together a local group of folks. So I wanted to make sure we didn't miss that opportunity for you to share a little bit more about your organization and how people might be able to become affiliated.
It's very easy.
So now,
Call me.
hey, absolutely. And we'll make sure that, of course, the biographical information on all of our panelists will be shared with all of you that have joined us today. So you'll be able to get in touch with any of us. So now that we've really delved into definitions and what's happening in the states, especially relative to data, I want to talk a little bit further about implementation and also the implications and the opportunities or lack thereof when we talk about ESAs. What can we learn about income limits? Some of you have already talked about that a little bit. Acceptance policies, the impacts of state, the impacts on state and district budgets, and just other things that you're seeing as you are observing what's happening state to state with ESA. So Beth, I'm going to go back to you and ask you to share a little bit more about what's going on in Arizona and what are some of the implications associated with implementation.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Terry. I think some people think of vouchers as, typically used for private school. And we sort of have this image of, some children getting plucked out of quote unquote failing schools and getting to go to these, beacons on the hill. And that's just not the reality of what we're seeing here in Arizona. The private schools are already full. They've already picked their students. We're not seeing this huge growth of incredible, academically focused private schools. We're seeing strip mall schools. We're seeing a lot of online, prep schools from out of state coming in and advertising on billboards. And there's no academic accountability for any of this. It's a grift. Yes, families are using them for private school expenses. These are the families that had already chosen private schools. They can be used for tuition, uniforms, those sorts of things. But also for anything for homeschool that is deemed educational. And so we've seen approvals for things like snow cone machines and bounce houses and chicken coops and, gym memberships and aquarium visits. And, it's sort of this mentality of, well, if you see it in a public school, then we should get to have it at home. And so, I told you already that they're bankrupting our state, these vouchers. And this is part of the reason. It's incredibly inefficient use of taxpayer dollars, along with some other things. If I see a baby grand piano in a high school and I know that that's going to be used by 100 students a year for 30 years, that's a different public investment than 30 different families having a baby grand piano in their living room. I would argue that if we're already underfunded and none of the kids in our state in public district schools or charter schools are getting what they need, then we need to focus on that first. Private lessons. So to me, as a parent, this is a big point of privilege to be able to take your child to horseback riding in the morning and then to Spanish lessons in the afternoon and to a cooking class the next day. And that's how it is being utilized. But you have to think about this reality. Like, this is not for working families. This is very, very hard for families that don't have, that are single income. Our families here in Arizona really rely on our local public schools. We need to be able to drop them off so that we can work. And, that's why these vouchers are mainly being used in wealthy zip codes and in the suburbs. And they're not being used as much in rural schools or in poor communities because it's incredibly hard to use if you're not somewhat privileged. And we see these great stories of choice, and I'm a teacher. I love every single student I've ever had. I want the best for them. I love my own kids. I get it. We want the best for our kids. But we also don't hear these stories of 1 million public school students in Arizona that are getting everything they need, but their experience is being defunded. I think about a student I had named Joy who hadn't been able to read until 4th grade, and she was at risk of not, being able to get to 4th grade. And now she's in 6th grade and her face is in a book all the time. She's a bookworm because she got all of those interventions of the local public school. And so the reality is, public schools have been discredited. There's this, a lot of push to say that public schools are all the things I don't want to repeat here. It's all tied up in these culture wars, but the reality is our public schools are actually providing an incredible experience to our kids. Next slide, Terry, thank you. And so I'll lay this out. I think Joanne already laid this out. Vouchers are really about the school doing the choosing, the micro school doing the choosing, or the homeschool having these points of privilege. Private schools don't have to accept families with vouchers. And I can't tell you how many families have come to us and have said, Beth, I thought I was so excited about this voucher. I thought you guys were full of it. I was really so happy to be able to go to the private school of my choice. And they couldn't get their kid accepted. They went to school after school after school. And, one kid's on an IEP. They can't get into any school. We've had families whose LGBTQ student was not accepted in school after school after school. We have schools here that openly discriminate in their admissions policies against LGBTQ students and their families and teachers. There's all these stories coming out, and it's perfectly legal for them to do that. And I think that is, for me, the strongest argument to not have state-funded schools that can openly discriminate. It leads to segregation. It leads to discrimination. And to me, that's not how we should be using public dollars. And yes, I believe in public schools, but that's because I believe in all students. And I think we need to focus on improving our public schools instead of walking away and spreading our taxpayer dollars around and picking and choosing kids.
Thank you for that, Beth. You make a really solid argument for why school choice certainly isn't the ultimate option, especially when we talk about students with special needs, when we talk about students that are English language learners, and all of the other range of student challenges that sometimes are not even identified or considered when individuals who are making the decisions about enrollment are considering these students. So I really appreciate that perspective. But I'd love to hear from Kate, because I know Kate brings a very different perspective when she thinks about students and families, and she's actually already shared some of those stories with us. So Kate, why don't you share with us a little bit more about not only what happened during the pandemic, but also what you see on the ground in New Hampshire and why a choice is good for your state.
Yeah, I will. I just first want to say I did also have a child who thrived in public school. Our program does seem to be for kids who need a different fit. And so that is slightly different than what you have in Arizona, although I also would be for every child having any opportunity or every opportunity every time. So I also wanted to just talk about, in essence, we hear from kids that are experiencing bullying and discrimination as kind of the top reason that families come to us. They also come to us because they need a smaller school setting. And then we also hear from kids with special needs. In addition, children that are LGBTQ plus are bullied at a much higher rate than other children. 65% of kids experience bullying. And so having a program like this in place where a child can go to a safer school, I think is a good policy. For example, Samuel, in the middle of this photo, took a knee at his high school during to protest police brutality, and that did cause a bunch of backlash His family had their windshield shot out by a BB, and he experienced threats at his school. And so his mom came to us at Children's Scholarship Fund for help. And she did move Samuel to a private school that embraced diversity and embraced him. He has continued his advocacy. He's now the first person from New Hampshire to go to Morehouse. And so Samuel is continuing his advocacy in his life, and he is just an example of a success story. It's interesting because Peter on the right also experienced bullying and discrimination, but a different type. So Peter wears a cross around his neck at school because he's religious, and he described the bullying that he experienced at school, wearing that as demoralizing and cruel. He said he was ridiculed at the school. So his mother came to us and got him help so that he could go to a school where he wouldn't be ridiculed for his religious beliefs. So he experienced religious discrimination. Gabe at the bottom is a special needs child. He has autism, and he was one of those kids who was a danger to himself and others in the school. He was being restrained and was subject sometimes to seclusion. His grandmother, that's his grandmother with him. She has him because of the opioid crisis, which really has touched everyone's lives. I know in New Hampshire, that is, we have a lot of grandparents that have their grandchildren. She got help from us and moved him to a Montessori school. And I don't know how much you know about Montessori, but it's all hands-on. And so for a child with autism, he can work independently and hands-on. By the time he got towards the end of his Montessori experience, he was so well adjusted that he actually made his karate studio promo video where he was telling people they should come to his karate studio and they would learn a lot. And now he is wearing a tie to school, and his grandmother thinks he's going to go to college. I heard something interesting about, or disparaging it sounded like, about kids using online ed. And so you'll find it interesting that Thomas, with the tie there, he actually lives on an organic farm in New Hampshire in a rural area. And he is a very gifted student. And he was working in his elementary school on Khan Academy in the hallway, which, they were really trying to meet his needs to the best of their ability. But his parents kind of thought, well, maybe there's a better way. He came to us for help, went to a little independent school. By the time he graduated, he was already doing calculus and physics in the 8th grade. So then he used our program to attend the Stanford Online High School, which is out of Stanford University in California, from his organic farm in Loudon, New Hampshire. And so that's just kind of the kids that we're seeing choosing the program. If you switch to the next slide, I just wanted to share that the demand was very palpable at the time. The pandemic really was so difficult for our most vulnerable families. You see Liam in the center. Liam gets occupational therapy, but he was his occupational therapist was only working with him online. And his mother was really struggling with the occupational therapy online. And so he used our program to attend a private school and then also to pay for in-person occupational therapy. And so in essence, the families at that time during the pandemic, drove this into being. And in essence, I hope I've illustrated that by sharing with you what the types of experiences are. Yes, our program in New Hampshire is small. It's a small percentage of kids, but I feel like it's a very important alternative for kids who need something different or a different type of learning experience, like Gabe, who definitely thrives in that Montessori school with the hands-on. And I'm going to stand by the fact that I'm a both and girl. I want you to be able to choose a public school with these funds. And in New Hampshire, we're finding families paying for public school tuition at out of district schools because we don't have open enrollment. And so I'm going to stand by my both and. I think you should be able to choose a public school with this or a private school, anything in between. So there you go.
Thanks, Kate. And again, I really appreciate you sort of putting names and faces on this discussion. Sometimes there are things that we don't always think about, but what you've done is to really help us to think much more broadly about how best to apply these vouchers in ways that meet varying needs of students, especially in your state. So thank you for that. I'm now going to turn to Joanne Mickens, who, again, obviously has some perspective on the effects of implementation, how implementation is going, what you're hearing from parents, and other thoughts that you have just around this really important topic. So Joanne? I think you're still on mute.
Sorry. I'd like to speak specifically using Mississippi as the example to answer that question. In Mississippi, and Beth mentioned about expenditures per pupil in Arizona, I would think that Mississippi somewhere on that list with you. And I have a slide that shows expenditures since the implementation of the MAEP here in Mississippi, the Mississippi Adequate Education Plan. And that law was passed in 1997. Where's my slide? And it just has two numbers on it. Not that one.
I think it's the next one.
Maybe the next. Maybe the next one.
There we go.
It is. It's a formula that's set by, it was set in state law to make sure that we were putting enough money aside for public schools. And those two numbers, that top number is the amount of underfunding for Mississippi's public schools in the current year. And you can see it's almost $280 million, the underfunding this year. The second number shows the underfunding since the legislature passed the law. Billions of dollars of underfunding of the schools. And so since that law was passed, the schools have been fully funded in only 2 years. And so the question for me, when it just seems so disingenuous that the state that cannot fully fund the schools where over 85% of its children attend, why would that state be pulling money away from that pot of underfunding to give it to special circumstances? In Mississippi, the voucher has to do with children with special needs. And there are some interesting statistics that I don't have a whole lot of time, but there are some interesting statistics around that. One of them being that 67% of the kids receiving, of the schools that those children with the vouchers attend, those children are served by public schools. They do not have the capacity to serve those students. And yet they are accepting state funding. And so I guess on principle, and as a representative of the PPS philosophy, the state's first job is to fund its public schools and support its public school students. And I hear the arguments or the cases made for children who have special circumstances, special needs. My question is, well, why don't parents engage with the public schools to come up with answers where our tax dollars are put into this pot? Why aren't we working harder to help public schools come up with the answers for these special circumstances? I believe that parents and parents from public schools believes that families are going to do what they believe is best for their children. Whether that is a parochial school, a private school, homeschool, whatever, it's every family's prerogative to do make the choice that's best for their children. but it's not their prerogative to use my tax dollars to pay for that choice. Because we put those tax dollars in a common pot so that we can support a system of schools in the state. So why don't we work to make those schools offer what we think they should, rather than pulling funding away? Now, I can make the case that if Mississippi has underfunded its public schools by over $3 billion, there shouldn't be money laying around to pull and give to any special circumstances. I believe that we should all work together on this. And to me, when the state does this, it's divisive. I just, so my final word is, why don't we work to make the public schools what we think they should be, rather than taking funding away to give the, I mean, 100,000 kids who are taking advantage of ESA, that sounds, oh, that's great, it's growing. That's nothing compared to the children, the number of children who attend public schools in this country. And that's where I think our money and our support should go. When parents make another choice, that's their prerogative, but they should pay for that choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective and the way you articulated that on behalf of parents for public schools. And I'm going to take us back to one of your earlier slides where you say, when parents, schools, and communities work together, everybody wins. And I really think that that's exactly what you've just articulated relative to ways that we should really be investing in the public education system, so individuals have the capacity for all of our children to win. So thank you, Joanne, appreciate that. So that takes us back to Ben. And Ben, I know that you have compiled some data on the demographics and the types of students that are being served by ESAs. If you could tell us about this and what we know about how families are using ESAs, maybe even beyond some of the examples that have already been shared, and building on what we heard from Kate, and also share your perspective on the opportunities and challenges that are ahead. And I think we may have to go back a little bit in our slides to get back to a few things that I think Ben wanted to lift up. So there we go.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. There's so much to address in this space, and there are definitely challenges when it comes to implementing ESAs. But when you see the focus is on where it should be, which is helping families find individual fit for their student, helping them succeed and thrive in the best way possible, you see the effort is well put into it, well worth it, and you see states succeeding at it like New Hampshire and others. It is encouraging and reminds us that, you know, our public education is focused on helping as many of our rising generation of children to succeed and thrive. And what this kind of system does it in a pluralistic fashion that represents the wishes of different parents to find communities and education options that fit those and serve those children. So there's the two basic spheres here. One is private school choice, and we talked about those three different kinds of programs earlier: the vouchers, the tuition tax credits, and the ESAs. And we can talk about those broadly. We can come to one set of conclusions when we look at ESAs as an opportunity for students to do things they couldn't do with a voucher or tax credit, to customize their education. What we know and what we see is not as clear. So we'll start with that piece first, ESAs. ESAs, the research on how they function and the results they're engendering is still something very much in progress, because many of these programs, as we demonstrated, are relatively new. But the two areas where we do have emerging research on ESAs at this point are parent satisfaction, recognizing that these kind of programs are fundamentally about showing parents have agency, empowering them, and providing accountability directly to them. It shouldn't be surprising that we see high levels of parent satisfaction reported in families who have newfound ability like the families highlighted in New Hampshire, to customize their education. The other area where we see research borne out, as we do with other forms of private school choice, is in the fiscal impact. And I think I probably overlooked this slide earlier. We don't need to go back to it, but the point from a macro level on all private school choice is that we're talking about 1.2% of K-12 students in the United States are benefiting from one of these three kinds of programs. And yet we're spending 0.5% of K-12 education dollars to help these students. The demonstration of that, as in some studies have shown, is that we're saving billions of dollars that could otherwise be spent, that remains in the public school system to benefit the students who are left behind there. And that's, I think, a point Kate has driven home well, is that this is not an either or, this is a both and. This is about helping individual students in whatever particular sector serves their interests and their needs best, and supporting and uplifting them as well. The other, and to that point, as you see here on this graph, this is a compilation of all rigorous research that's been done on private school choice programs in the United States. So it's a compilation, and the result where we see the most consistent and positive outcome from all kinds of private education choice programs, and one we would hope to see from ESA programs in particular, is the results on public school students. The competition, the pressure that's created by offering these options to families has demonstrated in multiple states that the public schools have more resources per student and are able to increase achievement modestly for students. That's a consistent finding in the research, and something we should be encouraged by, and recognize again that in a pluralistic education system that ESAs support, opening more doors of opportunity for families to choose private education, a hybrid education, a home education, a customized education, that this kind of competition will open the door. So to talk about how families and ESAs are using funds, you also asked that question. It's another area where we're in the process of learning. In some states, we're getting early data from. What we see is that about 2/3 of families, typically 60 to 70% of families, are using these funds primarily for tuition, like in private school, like a voucher or a tax credit. The remaining third of families are using these funds, either some of their funds or all their funds, to do things creatively and customize and innovate. This, I think, is probably the thing we need to look at the most closely and expect the greatest promise from the years to come, and that families who are empowered now to use these dollars to provide creative options for their families are going to provide innovations that show the larger education system how better to serve students. That would be our hope looking forward. So we can talk more about how that works out in different states. But over time, we're seeing states like Arizona and Florida that have had ESAs for a lengthy amount of time. Over time, we're seeing more families switch from that kind of traditional voucher-like use of funds to a more customized use of funds, which just goes to show that there is a demand out there for those families. And then again, as we see from this research here, that the impacts are neutral to positive on the system as a whole. So I think that's a good reason for us to be encouraged about the growth of ESAs going forward.
Thanks, Ben. Really appreciate understanding the research and what the data is telling us in this regard as well. So I want to make sure that we allow time for some of the questions that are in the Q&A that have come from the audience. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to maybe give a 1-minute closing statement that might help to capture your sentiments on this really important topic. And then from there, we'll go to Q&A. So I will start with you, Kate.
Sure, I think, I've learned a lot listening today to everyone's presentations, and I think the debate might be the difference between a debate about public schools and the discussion about public education. Because in our education freedom account in New Hampshire, it really is the way that many children are accessing their public education. And so I think of it as a public education program, where yes, they may be going to a different building or a building part-time, but that's the way they're accessing the state money for their public education, which leads me to the discussion or the thought that in New Hampshire, the education funding that the child is using is their state portion of the education money that belongs to them regardless. It would follow them to a different public school district if they switched already. It would follow them to a charter school if they switched already. And now they're just having it available in that digital platform to use to choose learning experiences. And so I'm thinking about it differently, definitely than the other panelists, where I see it as a way for children who need a different fit to still access public education. And in essence, you know, that money would follow the child regardless. It's a small state portion of our money. Most of our education funding in New Hampshire is local, so that might be different than some of the other states. But I think that's kind of my takeaway is, you know, I'm definitely talking about public education, including, you know, having public schools available to families as well. And so I think that's kind of where, you know, what I've learned today.
Thanks, Kate. Joanne.
Well, it has been a great experience, Kate. Kate, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And Beth made so many of the points that I formed on my behalf. So thank you, Beth, because I agree wholeheartedly with and PPS agrees wholeheartedly with your approach to this question of ESAs, vouchers, or whatever moniker we want to give them. I guess that what I don't want us to discount is the value of our public education system to our nation and to our democracy. It is, we're unique in a way, though there have been times that some have been held back from this, but today we see the value, and I hope we continue to see the value of this institution of public schools, where every person can be educated so that they can hopefully be participants in our way of life. And I think that at play today, so much of what we see in public discourse is a lack of understanding of who we are and how valuable this system of schools is to this country. And as we continue to slice and dice public education, whether it be slicing and dicing funding or families, I think that we put ourselves on a slippery slope to losing something very important to this nation. And I hope we keep that in mind, because if each of us is thinking about what is best for me, you know, I hate to quote Mr. Spock, but it's the needs of the many. And if I'm doing what's best for me, operating from a selfish point of view is not going to keep us together as a nation going forward, especially as we become more and more diverse. And if we don't learn to live together in public schools, where do we learn to live together?
Thank you, Joanne. I appreciate that. Ben, we'll go to you next, and Beth will let you close out the final comments from our panelists, and then we'll go to Q&A. So Ben?
Absolutely. I think the point we want to bring home, and I really appreciate this great conversation, is that you know, the opportunity to give families ability to customize education where wherever they were being served before was not serving them well, is ultimately about helping individual families find the best fit, creating a system that recognizes their agency and accountability. And a point I probably didn't address as much with ESAs is opens the door for creative educators to partner with parents and do creative things, recognizing that ESAs is one pathway. School choice programs are one pathway for families who want to try something different, either because their child is desperately not being served in the situation that they're coming from, or because they need something better and an option that they would not otherwise be able to pursue. And that to recognize and honor a system of pluralism like this, of different family values and different student needs, we can still be strong as a nation. and we can still show, we've seen through the research that these programs can and do strengthen the overall system by helping individual families find the most possible families find the best possible fit for them. So thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thanks, Ben. Beth.
Thank you so much to everybody. I really learned so much in this panel, and I just appreciate you all. And I know I really love that we can have differences of opinions and be so respectful, and to just, I think conversations like this are maybe kind of why I believe in public education, because like Joanne said, like where else are we going to learn to talk to each other like this, to be around other people with other ideas, to escape that sort of self-segregation that seems to be occurring here. I mean, what I'm watching unfold here in Arizona is real, and it's scary. And I really appreciate being able to explain that. I think it is very different from some other states. Like, you know, Kate, your experience in New Hampshire sounds really wonderful. And you know, I think we all want the same things for our communities and for our children. Here in Arizona, we've walked away from public education. We've walked away from funding it. And it has all been sort of used to usher in this fully realized universal voucher system. And it's creating haves and have-nots. It's creating winners and losers. And, you know, I don't know that we have any protections in place to protect our children. And I think a lot of this has been sold as free market. And that's fine when you're talking about like tennis shoes and coffee companies, but it's not okay when you're talking about our children. They only get one chance in an education, and our kids have, many of them have lost that, and they're going to continue to lose that because we can't fund two separate and unequal programs. So I hope that other states will listen and look to Arizona as a cautionary tale and do better. I hope that we will fully fund public schools. And the others on this call, I hope that we can all work together to just do what's best for kids in this country.
Thank you, Beth. I think that's a perfect segue to one of the questions that was posed by Becky Glover. If state legislatures aren't willing to adequately fund our American value traditional public education, I just lost the question. Hold on. Hold on. I hate it when this happens. Well, I just lost the question, but I think in essence, what she was asking is, if we aren't willing to fund public education at the highest levels, how can we expect that we're going to have the capacity over time to fund charters, to fund private education, to refund religious education, and to do all of the things that we need to do from a funding perspective if we're not willing to invest in public education? I think I captured the essence of it. Thoughts?
I guess I would just ask a question. I'm wondering, what does fully funded public education look like? How many, I mean, is there a dollar amount? I don't know. Is it different in every state? I'm curious. Does anyone have a benchmark?
I don't know, Ben, if you might have a benchmark, but I know that most states have a state, well, in Iowa, at least, we have state supplemental aid, which sets out the amount per pupil that we invest in, and that is increased, you know, based on a variety of factors, but certainly not based on the need to meet all of the educational needs of the student. So Ben, I don't know if there's anything else that you might add there.
It's a great question Kate raises, and one that is very difficult to answer. I think some baseline facts are, you know, it varies from state to state, right? But nationally, we're spending somewhere north of $14,000 to $15,000 per student, and a lot of that's before the influx of funds. I think the COVID relief dollars, well over $100 billion that came into the school system, has been a great test to demonstrate whether funding just one system and not funding students is the most effective way. And I think the results have been mixed at best. So,
any other perspectives on that question about underfunding of public education and how that then translates to our ability to fund all of these other things that need to happen based on changes in state law.
I mean, I know in New Hampshire, most of our public school building funding, right? I mean, I think of schools separate, right? Since that's what you guys have talked about, is local. And in the case of our education savings account, the child is using the state portion of the money and the local money is still staying local. But I remember too that we had a discussion in our prep where everyone was surprised. In New Hampshire, we're spending more like $25,000 per student. So I think it's very regional, the discussion. And so I'm not sure that I can fully answer the question, because I would have to ask the question writer, like, what does your education funding look like in your state? And for New Hampshire, what we're doing does make sense, where that state portion of the money is following the child to the thing that's right for them. Most of our education funding is local. Although I think, again, I would just ask, like, I don't know how much is the right amount. So it's hard to answer the question.
I'd love to answer just from a teacher's perspective. You know, having been in the classroom, we have very crowded class sizes. So I think, you know, if you're looking at the ultimate, like you would have 20 kids in the class instead of 35 kids in the class. You would have an aide or interventionist that could help every single child who needed help with math in the school. And that probably means, you know, staffing 5 to 10 individuals across like an elementary school. You would need to have funding for STEM resources, for extracurriculars, for music programs, for counselors, making sure that that ratio is appropriate. It's expensive and it's a lot of adults in the building. What we have in Arizona is the opposite of that. We have the second worst counselor to student ratio. We have just these huge class sizes. I had 36 sixth graders in my class for many, many years. It's really hard to meet their needs. We don't have aides and interventionists that aren't funded through COVID relief dollars. So, you know, Ben, we've been really appreciative of those dollars, and it's really scary to see them drying up in 2024 because I don't know how we're going to meet those needs, and the needs are still there. So I guess, you know, a fully funded education probably is between $15,000 and $20,000 per child. And yes, I think that would vary by state. Arizona is given about $9,000 per child, according to last week's U.S. Census Bureau report. And, you know, that means our kids are $4.5 billion behind the national average every single year in our state. They're not getting what they need. They're not.
Beth, could you support a program like we have in New Hampshire if it was just extra money? If they were spending $20,000 a kid, and then they kept paying the money, even if a child left and had to go somewhere else because of a special circumstance? I mean, could you support something like that?
I mean, I think there's obviously a lot of movement within that, but I mean, I think that speaks to the fact that there are fixed costs for a school, right? So I answered a question from Melody, but just for everybody, if we have 7 kids leave a school on an ESA voucher, that's an entire teacher's salary, right? And those 7 kids might be spread like K through 5, and it doesn't seem like a big deal. It's just 7 kids in a whole big school, right? And it's not an appreciable difference for air conditioning or busing or cafeteria workers, right? Like 7 kids, but it's $7,000 per kid in Arizona. That's almost $50,000. You're going to have to cut a teacher. You're going to have to cut one of those aides and interventionists. You're going to be down a counselor. And what I'm trying to explain is we're so far behind that those cuts are truly horrific for our children who are choosing public schools.
Thank you, Beth. I really appreciate sort of the counterpoint between you and Kate during that discussion. I'm going to shift our discussion to another question that really sort of goes to something I think, Beth, you raised, and something, Joanne, that you raised as well, around the different standards that exist in public schools, private schools, religious schools, etc. So this question came from Greg Facey. Since different states have loosened teacher certification regulations, how do you, darn it, now the poll popped up. How do you think this will impact ESA funding utilization being directed towards non-certified teachers? So thoughts about that, differentiation in standards, and how we continue to fund both sort of at equal levels without the same standardization, without the same rules and regulations, and without the same, sort of level playing field where one is the same as the other. You're funding the same thing.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. It's a big topic. So, first of all, I'd say studies on the effectiveness of traditional teacher certification versus alternative versus uncertified teachers, the bell curves of those different categories show the effectiveness in improving student learning is relatively small. I think the focus of an ESA program is put more on the outcomes and the direct accountability to the parents. And so if that funding follows the student and the family makes that choice, they can, they're dissatisfied, they can take the funding elsewhere. And a lot of parents, they want to choose a school with a certified teacher, and that'd be to their within their rights and their power to do so. The other thing I think is you're getting at in the bigger question about two different systems with two different sets of regulations is whether we should be thinking about imposing more regulations on the inputs of education on alternative programs like ESAs, or whether we should be thinking about creative ways to deregulate public education systems so they can compete more effectively. And one of the overlooked parts of Florida's recent ESA legislation, House Bill 1, was they created some powerful incentives to find ways to remove some of those regulations on public school systems that may make the spending there less effective. I think what you see when I was pointing out the studies and the research on impacts of choice on public school programs is that impact it tends to be positive because there is a way and there's room and there's incentive for school systems to figure out how to spend dollars more effectively. So I think deregulation could be part of that strategy.
That kind of goes to my thinking that why can't parents work with school districts to come up with some different means in order to give them what they'd like for their children, rather than taking their balls and going home. Why not stay and work on it together?
As a classroom educator, I'm actually on the other side of things in terms of deregulation. I've seen the watering down of standards for excellence. And it really scares me. I was an alternative pathway teacher. I got my bachelor's in education and realized I wanted to be a teacher, or not in education, sorry, and realized after the fact. So I did one of those alternative, you kind of like Teach for America, where you get 5 weeks of training and you get into a master's program. And I got to tell you, I was a terrible teacher for my first 2 years. I had no idea what I was doing. I was landed into one of the poorest schools in Maricopa County, and had 42 students, no computer, no textbook, had no idea what to do or how to do it. And I figured it out, but I think I'm one of the only teachers in my cohort that's still teaching. And our veteran teachers are leaving, and I don't think that watering down, the profession and what it means to be an incredible teacher is the way to go. Because it is a science. It is not just an art. It is not just a profession. It is a science.
And just to clarify, I would say deregulating the inputs that go into public schooling or schooling in general, not lowering the standards of excellence or transparency. I think we could agree on that part.
Yeah. Kate, any short final comment before I close this out? Want to make sure we stay on time.
The discussion about teachers just made me think of, one of my, maybe this is a story to lead to what you guys have been talking about. I told you that one of my kids was very happy at public school, and actually one of their teachers did leave to start their own independent school during the pandemic. And we do miss that teacher a lot. I'm glad that the teacher has kids there that are participating in our education savings account program. And I don't have any problem saying you'll love that school. the school leader and the lead teacher is great because it was one of my kids' teachers at one of our area high schools. So, you know, I think it's again, my experience has been that people are thinking outside of the box. The parents of today are not the same parents pre-pandemic. I think the teachers of today are also not the same teachers pre-pandemic. We all learned something. We all had something that impacted us tremendously in this whole experience. And I'm really enjoying watching people understand what their kids' needs are and working to meet those needs. And I'm also, you know, even though I was sad that one of my favorite kids' teachers left, you know, their public school to start an independent school, you know, the teacher said that he realized that kids learned better in a smaller group setting. And so he had to do that. And, you know, that kind of leads to what you were talking about, Beth, also, you know, wishing you had smaller group settings in your classrooms. Again, I think, you know, I'm glad to see we're at least partly reimagining things.
Thanks so much. So at the outset, I indicated that you would be, we would be sharing both a spirited and engaging discussion. And I don't believe that our panelists under-delivered. They definitely delivered. And I want to thank Joanne, Beth, Kate, and Ben for an engaging conversation this morning. There's so many other topics we likely could have covered within this context, but thank you so much for your participation. And of course, thanks to the campaign for grade level reading for exposing us to this really important conversation. I'll turn it back over to Emily.
Thank you. And I'm just going to reiterate the thanks. Terry, thank you for the really, really brilliant moderation, because this was a tough topic and we had lots of differing perspectives and you were brilliant. And so thank you, thank you, thank you, Beth, thank you, Kate, thank you, Ben, thank you, Joanne. This has been an incredible learning discussion. I've learned an immense amount, and we cannot thank you enough, and we cannot thank you on behalf of the GLR network, and thanks to all of the great participation. And we did post the links for our upcoming sessions. Please join us for GLR week. Please join us next week and the following weeks for our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays. And I know we're getting to a minute past our time, so thank you to everybody and have a good rest of your day today.